Before we talk about the future of African stock exchanges, it is worthwhile taking a step back and see how these markets have evolved over the last 10 years, between 2000 and 2010. I think reflecting the strong growth that we've seen in many African economies, African stock markets have been, during the last decade, among the best performers in the world. In fact, I had a look at some of the data concerning most of the exchanges over that 10-year period. On average, the African stock exchanges have generated annualized returns of 15% plus, which is quite substantial. And we've also seen a major change in the total value or total market capitalization of these markets that have ex-South Africa. If we exclude South Africa, these markets have grown by more than 500% between 2000 and 2010 on the back of the solid performances of the listed companies, but also on very successful IPOs that have characterized the exchange space during that period. We've got Safaricom's, the like of others that have really boosted market cap. And total value traded also in absolute dollar terms has really gone up. So right now, of course, when we look at what has been happening since 2008, we've seen that there is a growing correlation between the movements of African markets and the rest of the world. And I think that in the next few months, we should expect a lot of volatility characterizing these markets as the developed markets. And we'll see many of these markets go down, reflecting the threats that African commodities prices might drop, and that investments in Africa might also experience a slowdown. But once the dust settles on this crisis, I personally think that there's a lot of growth scope for most of the African markets. In fact, if anything, I strongly believe that African stock markets will benefit from the shift of economic momentum from the West to the center and to the East. And I also think that we're going to see more and more, as Bob Geldof and other speakers this morning pointed out, more and more FDIs flowing into Africa. Why? Because Africa is home to 25% of the world's resources. So, with China growing, with India growing, I think there will be growing demand for Africa's resources to support the growth momentum in these countries. And I think that markets are going to benefit from that. This being said, I still believe that there are certain very important initiatives that need to be taken, both at the macro level and at the micro level, to unlock this potential that I've been highlighting. At the macro level, I think African countries should keep trying to improve their business environment and try to join the top 30, top 40 countries in the World Bank ease of doing business. I think also that governance should be improved at the political level, but also at the company level. And I also think that African countries should open up more and try to attract more investments. And at the micro level, I think that it is very important for stock exchanges throughout the continent to stimulate what I call the 4 Ps that characterize the exchange space. What are these 4 Ps? Products, players, participants, and partnership. I think there is scope to increase the breadth of products that are traded on these markets. We've seen that most of the African markets are essentially equity-based, but it's high time that they move up the value chain and start trading other securities like bonds, like futures, ETFs, and so on. And I see that some of the exchanges like Egypt, Morocco, and even Nigeria have started moving up the value chain. In Mauritius, we are working very closely with the central bank to establish a secondary market for government benchmark bonds, with the hope that eventually this creates an enabling environment for the pricing of corporate bonds and makes our financial services sector more efficient in channeling resources. I also think that we need to attract international players. So in terms of stimulating 4Ps, we need to attract more investors from the international investment community. But we're already seeing that happening. In fact, on most markets today, 40 to 45% of the daily trading volumes are accounted for by foreign investors, and I think this is going to grow over time. We'd also need to bring in foreign participants. I'm essentially referring here to foreign brokers, foreign investment banks, so as to come and add value and allow many of these markets to move up the value chain. So all in all, I think I'm very optimistic about African stock exchanges going forward. And at the level of the African Securities Exchange Association, we're trying to increase the visibility of African stock exchanges. We've upgraded our website so as to reflect daily prices, end-of-day daily prices of all the African exchanges, so that this website becomes a one-stop shop for any investor who is interested in African exchanges, African markets, and want to have an understanding of what's going on in these markets. We're also discussing with a major international index provider to create a Pan-African index and use that index as an investable benchmark for international investors. And we hope that eventually this index will enable the creation of an African exchange-traded fund that can be listed and traded on many exchanges. And we're also busy at the level of the African Securities Exchange Association linking up with multilateral institutions like the African Development Bank and the World Bank, but more importantly, the African Development Bank, to see how the African Development Bank can work together with ASIA so as to scale up the activities within the capital market sphere in Africa. We are thinking here of encouraging the African Development Bank's investment in private equity funds to use the stock exchanges as an exit mechanism. So there are a number of initiatives that we're pursuing right now so as to really enable, at the end of the day, capital markets, stock exchanges to play a more meaningful role in supporting the real economies in Africa. And I personally think that this is what we're going to see going forward, and we're going to ride the wave of growth in Africa and really become an important player within that space.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.